Alrighty, welcome to our second to last lecture, everybody. Just a couple more chapters to get through. And these last two hopefully will be kind of fun for everyone because this is kind of putting it all together, right? This entire last unit has been the nervous system, and these first few chapters that we've discussed is kind of building the basis of how neurons are structured and how action potentials work, the structure of the spinal cord, an organization of nerves, and generally how information travels through the spinal cord, and then the organization of the brain and which parts of the brain are responsible for different things. And so now moving into our somatic pathways and then the autonomic nervous system, we'll be learning essentially how to put all that information together. So from sensation to perception and then response, or maybe even skipping perception, if we're talking about visceral organs, our autonomic nervous system, right? We're not aware of those things, so it skips that perception part, going from sensation to response, or just straight up to response without sensation in some cases. And that's basically what's being discussed in these last two chapters. So putting all that information together, following the pathway of what parts of our body are sensed by what things and how that information travels to the brain. And then if we want to respond to that information, how that response is going to travel from the brain to whatever organ or tissue needs to respond to it. That's basically all of this pathways info and the autonomic nervous system info. And so we're going to start with some reminders about things, or I guess before I start getting into the chapter content. I saw only 5 people submitted responses to the brain case studies, which is totally fine. Of course, all assignments in this course are technically optional, depending on where you want your points from. But so I'm not going to start class going over like the key the responses to those case studies, but if we have time at the end, I'm happy to pull up that key and talk about it. For those that did look at it, it was a list of, I think, 7 different scenarios or famous patients or famous doctors that examined damage to a particular area or noticed very specific symptoms, and then that led to our understanding of which part of the brain is responsible for those symptoms, or which part of the brain, damage to which parts of the brain would cause particular symptoms. So, like I said, I'll go over that at the end if we have some time for it, but since there was such a low response rate, I won't start with that right away. So we'll focus on the chapter 15 content first. Okay, so sensory and motor somatic pathways. So this chapter is mainly focusing on the things that we have an awareness of. So mostly information that's going to be integrated by the cortex, right? Our higher level thinking and responses. We are discussing some visceral sensation and visceral motor response just because they overlap with some of these things. But most of our visceral sensation and response is going to be discussed in the next chapter on the autonomic nervous system. So this is mainly our somatic pathways. Okay. And so first reminder here of our division of our nervous system. We can talk about it as afferent or efferent. So the affect, the cause, and the effect, the result, right, the product. So the afferent division is referring to our sensation. So the cause, the signal that's being sent, providing info that we can then respond to using the efferent division, our motor responses. And so, yeah, the afferent division is describing all the sensory information from our external and internal environment. That information is almost always, or should always, I guess I'm not 100% sure, so I'll say almost always traveling in an ascending direction. We need to get the information about that sense to the brain so the brain can either become aware of it and or respond. And so these are going to be traveling upwards. They will be ascending. If we look back at chapter 13 really quick, right, where we discussed the organization of these different routes and where various information is traveling along these parts of the gray matter in our spinal cord. Okay. So sensory information is going to enter the spinal cord from our dorsal roots. So on the back side, the posterior side, information is coming in on the dorsal side, and then it will ascend mostly through the posterior gray horn all the way up, some of it through the visceral, okay, until it reaches the brain or target tissue of the brain stem. right, that is going to respond to that. Our motor responses are going to be sent descending down from the brainstem through the anterior or the dorsal horns, and then some of the lateral for our visceral motor control. And then they will leave the spinal cord, they will leave the central nervous system through our ventral roots. So sensory information is coming in through the back and will ascend through the back, the dorsal side of our spinal cord. And then motor information is descending, traveling down the anterior portion of our spinal cord, and then will leave through the ventral root. And that should be true 99.9% of the time. I know there are some differences for specific responses in some of these pathways, but 99.9% of the time will follow that general structure. So sensory information in through the back and up, motor information down through the front and then out through the front. Cool. So a general overview of what this looks like. Okay, so the ideas of how action potentials start and transmit still apply even to talking about sensing information. So not just applying to a thought transmitting to a signal that has a response, but you should also be thinking about those graded potentials leading to action potentials when thinking about sensation as well. Right? So touching something is going to start a graded potential or stimulate a graded potential, and the sum of those responses causing that graded potential have the ability to cause an action potential. So we have graded potentials that will lead to action potentials, and that will ultimately cause a graded potential on the next axon, on the next neuron, which will lead another action potential down that axon, etc. So yeah, keep that in mind. So we have our stimulus causing a graded potential. If that graded potential reaches threshold, that will cause an action potential to travel down that axon to the spinal cord in the case of sensation. And so that's all propagation, the propagation of that action potential from along that axon. The central nervous system will process that information. So whether that's in the spinal cord as a reflex, or if it's going all the way up to the brain and brainstem, some part of the central nervous system is going to process that info and provide a response. And then that response can either be involuntary or voluntary. On average, about 1% of our sensory information is actually making it to our conscious awareness. We are only perceiving 1% of the sensory information that our body is experiencing at all times. So most of our responses and our sensation is involuntary. Very, very few or a very small amount of it is going to produce a voluntary response that you are aware of. And so for most of this chapter, we're going to focus on the afferent division, our sensation. We'll talk about one of the efferent division pathways, but we'll mostly be talking about our three major sensory pathways. And so all of our sensory pathways are going to start with some type of a sensory receptor. So these are typically going to be groups of cells. For an exteroreceptor, these are going to be located near the surface of the organism or located near the surface of some tissue for the interoreceptors. And these are designed to transduce stimuli from our external environment into the release of neurotransmitters that ultimately causes that sensation and response. So we're receiving the sensation, receiving the signal, and then stimulating a response through the rest of our neurons. So we have three major types of sensory receptors: our exteroreceptors, ext referring to the external environment. These are those that are providing info from the external environment. So the opposite of that would be our interoceptors. So these are monitoring our internal environments, so mostly our visceral functions, our organs. And then we have proprioceptors. And so proprioception is your awareness or oftentimes subconscious, your unconscious, so lacking awareness, but your body's understanding of where you are positionally in your environment. So where your skeleton is, where your muscles are, I guess most of that sensation is coming from your muscles. You aren't really sensing your bone itself, but the movement of the muscles and their position, that is all proprioception. So information from our external environments, information from a majority of our organs and internal environments, and then information specifically about the position and movements of skeletal muscles as our three major categories of sensory receptors. We'll talk more about this in the next chapter, but essentially there is a lot of monitoring of your internal environment that is required for you to maintain your homeostasis, your steady state. So awareness of what types of chemicals are traveling through your blood. Do you have enough access to oxygen? Do you have enough access to glucose, enough access to calcium? Right, we've talked about various systems as parts of our tissues that are responding to or rely on these things. See, most of that is chemical tension, right? In a lot of our organs, a lot of our digestive enzymes and hormones are in response to changes in tension within things like our stomach, and that applies to a lot of our organs as well. But focusing back on the somatic system, which again is the main focus of this chapter, we have four major types of stimuli that are initiating sensory receptors. So we have chemicals initiating chemoreceptors, temperature being sensed by thermoreceptors, pressure and touch being sensed by mechanoreceptors, vibrations could be included there. And then lastly, pain being sensed by nociceptors. And so when we start looking at the different types of pathways, we'll talk about which sensations they're responsible for responding to, or what types of signals they are sending, what senses they are sending to the brain. And so you'll see those terms come back up again. So each of our sensory receptors has its respective receptive field. And so we have, specifically thinking about touch, right, with our mechanoreceptors, some of our touch sensation is going to provide a crude sense of touch, where you have a general idea of the area on like your skin that is touching something. And then we have areas that have a fine or will produce a fine sense of touch. And so this is a response to their receptive field. The receptive field is describing the total area that is monitored by a single receptor neuron. So the smaller that receptor field is, the more particular, the finer that sensation is going to be. So in areas where you have crude sensation of touch, where maybe you can't pinpoint exactly what is being touched, but the general area is firing, telling you something's touching there, right? That would have a larger receptive field. There's one receptor neuron covering an entire area or responsible for sensing that entire area. And then where you have fine senses of touch, like on the palms of your hand or the bottoms of your fingers, right? You have a lot of fine sensation and motor control. Those receptive fields are going to be a lot smaller. So the main idea here is just the definition, really, that the receptive field is describing the total area monitored by that single receptor neuron, but that does apply to crude versus fine touch. So a smaller receptive field would give you finer, more specific sensation. A larger receptive field would provide crude sensation. And then our last important concept before we move into some more specifics is the idea of adaptation. So some of our receptor neurons are going to be fast adapting and some are slow adapting. And we can generalize this by the type of sensation. And this applies to that idea of which sensations you are paying attention to and which ones are not. Okay? So having nervous systems and pathways of receptor neurons that can be fast adapting, meaning that they will respond strongly at first, but then will quickly stop sending the same signal from that same sensation. Right? This is really helpful for cutting out the noise. Right? If you are in a room that is constantly humming, like right now, as I'm talking about it, I became aware of the noise of the heater rattling and rumbling as it's sending out air into this room, but I was not thinking about that or sensing that or perceiving that until I was trying to be consciously aware of everything. Right? So that sensory reception is fast adapting. Although I heard it at first because there was a change into what stimuli was around me, as it became more consistent, and it's not an important thing to consistently be aware of, my neurons adapted and stopped sending that signal. There was some other inhibitory control stopping me from perceiving it. But then we also have receptors that are slow adapting. And so this would be more advantageous for these sensations that you want or should be constantly aware of, things that are more crucial, that would be more biologically expensive or damaging if they were left unchecked. So something like your sensation of pain, being aware that there is damage to an area so that you can either seek out something to help with that, or at the very least, not try to use that tissue in the same way. Okay. So those are slow adapting. As the stimulus is going to continuously cause a response, cause that sensation, whereas a fast adapting neuron or a fast adapting receptor would essentially start to ignore that sensation or ignore the stimulus and not provide a sensation. So that's adaptation. We throw around this word a lot in a bunch of different contexts in biology. Like in evolution, adaptation means a completely different thing. In colloquial speak, adaptation means a completely different thing, or I guess more similar. But this is one of the only areas when using the term adaptation in biology where it's talking about a quick change. In most other contexts, adaptation is something generational, like with evolution, or it takes a long time to adapt. But our neurons can adapt quickly. Okay. So as we are experiencing or receiving information from our external environments, so our exteroreceptors, a majority of those are going to be in our skin, right? The barrier between us and our external environment. It gets more complex, and there are a lot more examples as we move towards the skull, where we have things like our mouth, nose, ear, and eyes that are all interacting with our external environments, or the genitals and anus interacting with the external environment. But a majority of our sensation of our external environment is in our skin. And so our skin has a lot of these specialized tactile receptors that have some slightly different structure related to the types of sensations they're responsible for. This is not in our study guide, so I won't spend too much time going into it. I provided it here to show the examples. There's the figure in the text, and this is kind of cool to see the structural difference of these things and how we respond to different types of stimuli from our environment. But since it's not something you'll be assessed on, I can just come back to this if people are interested in learning more. These are essentially just specialized receptors, right? Some just have completely free nerve endings extended all the way through into the dermis or into the lower layers of our epidermis. Most of these are just in our dermis. Some are in our hypodermis, like our lamellar corpuscles. Right? We have another depiction of that here. You can see that different organization. So we have different neuron types, different receptor neuron types for different sensations of our skin. I guess that would be the main concept here. But like I said, it's not in the study guide, so you won't be assessed on these specifics here. Okay. So now we can actually get into our pathways. So we're focusing on the three major sensory pathways, somatic sensory pathways in this chapter. And all of these somatic sensory pathways, I guess I can't even say that. Two of these three, a majority of our sensation that we're going to be talking about, is transmitted through a 3-neuron pathway. And I think this is the first time where the length of neurons is going to come into play as far as actually being able to conceptualize how long these cells are. Because there are only 3 neurons involved in sensing something and getting that information to the brain. And then for one of our pathways, there's only 2 neurons involved from sensing that thing and getting that info to the brain. So these neurons are really, really long cells. Like if you cut into the optic nerve or into any of the nerves, or cut into the spinal cord that we were dissecting, right? All those individual fibers basically run most of that length of the spinal cord unless they leave with their nerve and then run most of the length to where they are innervating. Right? These neurons are really, really long. So it only takes 3 neurons to get sensory info from the receptor all the way to the brain that will respond, the part of the brain that will respond to it. And so we refer to these by the order that they show up, again, for sensation. So starting with wherever the receptor is, that is our first order neuron. This is the sensory neuron, and that will deliver its sensation all the way to the spinal cord, and sometimes all the way up to the brainstem before it synapses with another neuron. The second order neuron is the first part of our central nervous system that is now part of the sensory pathway. And these are interneurons. So they are basically responsible for just transmitting the signal that we're sensing to whatever part of the brain or to the thing that's going to determine where it goes in the brain, right? So the thalamus. And most of the time, or very often anyways, our second order neurons, these interneurons in our spinal cord or brainstem, will decussate or decussate. Okay. This term is referring to when a neuron is traveling across the center, so from the right side to the left side or vice versa. So if you see the term decussate, that is referring to moving from one side to the other. And so going along with that idea, if these neurons can cross from one side of the central nervous system to the other, we can refer to how we're responding or how we're sensing and where we are responding and sensing with terminology related to its position. So for most of our sensory pathways, that information is going to decussate at some point. And so most of what you are sensing, so something from my left hand is going to be sensed by the right hemisphere of my cortex. So the primary somatosensory cortex and my parietal lobe of the right hemisphere is going to respond to left sensation. And that applies to a majority of our senses. At some point, the neurons are going to cross to the opposite side. And so the right hemisphere is mainly responsible for sensing and responding to things from the left side of the body. And the left hemisphere is mainly responsible for sensing and responding to things from the right side of the body. And we got to see in the brain case studies activity some of those major periods in our history where we started to learn that idea. Okay, so the first order neuron was the receptor, it senses. It then takes that signal to an interneuron, which is often going to cross or decussate. And then the third order neuron is going to have its cell body, its dendrites in the thalamus. And we introduced that the thalamus is basically the postal system of our brain, of our central nervous system. It will then process and determine where that sensory information needs to go, which primarily, in the case of what we're talking about, is going to be the primary somatosensory cortex. So quickly jumping over to our PowerPoint from chapter 14, right? Looking at the lobes of the brain and some of these major sensory and motor areas. Right? A majority of the information that we're talking about as far as sensation, somatic sensation, is going to be sent to the primary somatosensory cortex right here on this central gyrus of the parietal lobe. And then most of our motor information, our motor response, is going to be leaving from the primary motor cortex of our frontal lobe. And so the thalamus is basically just ensuring that that info needs to go there. And if it needs to go to a different area of the cortex, it will send it there instead. So a majority of these pathways, a majority of our sensation is traveling with this format. Sensory neuron sending a signal to an interneuron, which will send that signal to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends that to the cortex, to the area of the cortex that it will respond to. And so when sensation is on the opposite side that it was sensed on, so perception, I guess, when perception is on the opposite side of where you sensed it, that is contralateral, like contrary to common belief, opposite to opposite, contra, opposite. That's on the opposite side of the body. Ipsilateral is referring to the same side. So if you're perceiving on the same side that you sensed on, or responding on the same side that is sending that signal. Right. And so we have three major somatic sensory pathways. Again, mostly referring to things, their senses that you would be aware of. Our spinocerebellar pathway has some visceral or a lot of visceral role. It's mainly just transmitting those signals to your cerebellum, and thus you are not consciously aware of it. And so that's mostly about keeping your body where it's supposed to be, responding to proprioception. But for these other two, which is where a majority of our sensory info is traveling through, that will make it to our conscious perception, our awareness of it. And so all of these pathways exist as symmetrical pairs. So you would have one on the right and left side of your body. And then those axons will share common origins and destinations, even in those parallel tracks. So we have our spinothalamic, and as the name suggests, coming from the spinal cord to the thalamus, we have our posterior column pathway, which isn't as nice of a name. What's the other name? The dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, I guess, is a bit nicer as far as telling you where it's going. But basically, sensory information traveling up the posterior horns, the posterior column pathway, and then our spinocerebellar. So information coming from the spinal cord to the cerebellum through that pathway. Okay. So as I mentioned before, sensory information is coming through the dorsal roots, or posterior roots, and then will mainly be traveling up those dorsal horns. It's a gray map. Or out of those dorsal horns. Okay. So here's a look at that primary, our spinothalamic pathway, the largest somatic sensory pathway. And so let's follow one of these paths from beginning to end. So we have our first order neuron transmitting that sensory information all the way from whatever part of the body was sensing it into the spinal cord, where it will synapse with an interneuron. That interneuron decussates over to the opposite side, and then continues traveling all the way up through the brainstem to the thalamus, where it synapses with our third order neuron, and then the thalamus sends that information to the primary somatosensory cortex. So in the last chapter, I showed you that silly looking little guy, that homunculus. Where's he at? Boom. Referring to the relative size of the brain dedicated to each of these things. We can separate this further into our sensory homunculus and our motor homunculus, which we have represented in these figures here. So you can see our sensory homunculus, again, showing a generalization and overview of the portion of the brain, or how many neurons essentially, that are responsible for perceiving that sensation from that area of the body. And so we can technically split this into two separate tracts. So there are two separate tracts that make up this spinothalamic pathway. The overall pattern of what's happening is generally the same, and I believe that's the extent of what you were asked to keep track of on the study guide. Let me just double check. Name and type of information only. Yeah, okay. So the spinothalamic pathway is responsible for bringing conscious sensation of crude touch, so having those larger receptive fields, providing crude touch, crude pressure, and then sensing pain through those nociceptors and temperature. So those two different pathways are just responsible for like different types of sensation from the same general areas. And so that anterior spinothalamic tract is for crude touch and pressure, and then the lateral spinothalamic tract is for pain and temperature. But you won't see that on an assessment, though you may see that on a quiz. But the general idea here, information comes in, interneuron desiccates, that takes it all the way to the thalamus, and then the thalamus transmits that signal to whatever part of our primary somatosensory cortex is responsible for that area of the body. And then our two other pathways are posterior and spinocerebellar. So we'll start with the posterior. It's still following that same general idea of we have three neurons in this pathway. However, decussation doesn't happen in the spinal cord this time. With the posterior column pathway, that crossing over occurs in the medulla oblongata. So it travels up the same side of the spinal cord from whatever side of the body is sensing it until it reaches the brainstem. So we had decussation basically immediately as the sensation made it to the spinal cord in our spinothalamic path. And this one, that sensation is traveling ipsilaterally until the brainstem. It doesn't cross over until the brainstem. But other than that, the 3-neuron rule is the same. And so whereas the spinothalamic pathway was responsible for crude touch and pressure, our posterior column pathway has sensation of fine touch and pressure, and then also plays a role in our sensation of vibration and some of our conscious proprioception, or all of our conscious proprioception, I should say. So again, proprioception is our awareness of where our skeletal muscles are, so generally our body position within our environment. So when you feel the sensation of your leg being pushed, right, you are getting proprioceptive information about the position of your leg along with the sensation of touch. And they may be traveling through different paths. You may have crude touch information, mechanoreception, traveling through your spinothalamic path, but then you will be getting your conscious proprioception, your awareness of where those muscles are, through the posterior column path. And I'm being specific of pointing out that conscious awareness of where your body is positioned, because our last pathway here, the spinocerebellar pathway, is basically just responsible for our unconscious proprioception. So not that you are necessarily aware of, but it is constantly being monitored of how your body is positioned, how muscles are positioned in the body in general, those skeletal muscles. And this pathway is different from our other two for a few different reasons. Not only is there not much somatic info here, we're not really aware of it. This is almost all visceral, as it's part of the cerebellum instead of part of the cerebrum or cortex. But we also only have 2 neurons in our spinocerebellar pathways. So information is coming in, synapsing with the second order neuron in the spinal cord, and then that second order neuron takes the info all the way to the cerebellum, right? We're not making it to the thalamus, where it would potentially synapse with a third order. Since it's not going all the way up into the diencephalon, that second order neuron is transmitting that sensation all the way to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum's main role is that control and monitoring regulation of your muscles and body position. And so we do have 2 different tracts here as well. We have 2 different tracts with the posterior column too. But something important about this one is the different tracts decussate at different times, or don't decussate, I guess, would be better to say. Okay? So our posterior spinocerebellar tract here does not cross over to the opposite side. Right? So that proprioceptive information is from the same side that it's being perceived on, or not perceived, but being sensed on. But our anterior tract does decussate in the spinal cord. So one major difference there, does not transmit for some of the information, and only has 2 neurons. It does not transfer over, does not decussate, does not cross for some of our information, and only has 2 neurons in that pathway. But again, checking the study guide to make sure I'm not giving too much or too little. Yeah, I don't think there's nothing on the study guide specific to the spinocerebellar pathway. So that's more of an FYI for your awareness. Right. And then referred pain is discussed in this chapter, but again, this is another visceral thing, or mainly looking at how we perceive pain from our organs and the general parts of our body that will respond to that. I guess, okay, never mind. I understand the connection here. Okay. So pain that we are feeling, or the damage to our organs, that damage is going to be perceived viscerally. You aren't necessarily aware of the fact that your heart is hurting, but you will sense pain through your somatic sensory receptors near that organ. I believe that's why it's being talked about here, right? So these referred pains, talking about how the pain is referred to receptor neurons on parts of the body around that organ. Like you would feel pain in your upper torso and arm, even though it is the damage that you are perceiving is actually from the heart. You could perceive pain in this lower portion of your torso or the backs of your shoulders, but the actual damage is in the liver and gallbladder. So that referred pain, so that you become consciously aware that something is wrong without necessarily being able to localize that that pain is coming from an internal organ, because that would be monitored viscerally. Right. And this is a reference table showing the 2 different tracts for each of our pathways. So again, looking at the study guide, from what I described, you should know a majority of the details about the posterior column pathway. So how the three different neurons travel, like the passage of their axons, where they decussate, and then the function and type of sensory info. So conscious sensation of fine touch, pressure, vibration, or conscious proprioception, recognizing that the second order neuron is synapsed and decussates in the medulla oblongata, so in the brainstem, compared to this one, which decussates in the spinal cord. Cool. And then for the spinothalamic pathways, just knowing the name and type of information. So just knowing the type of info for our spinothalamic path. So crude, touch, and pressure, and then pain and temperature. And then there's nothing on our study guide about the spinocerebellar, so you will not see this, or at least you will not be asked about information related to this on the exam, the assessment. But those are our three principal ascending sensory pathways. So is there anything about this that you guys would like me to touch back on before we move on to motor pathways? Okay. I can provide the type of questions that I would like to ask about this. I need to be very careful with how they're worded and what I'm asking because of how specific I was with, or how specific the study guide currently is. But the type of question I would like to ask with this, and you see an example of it on the quiz, would be like if there was damage to the left posterior or dorsal portion of your medulla oblongata, what symptoms might come with that, like your inability to sense certain things or your inability to produce a motor response, as we talk about motor pathways here in a second, right? Or if there is damage to the anterior right portion of your spinal cord at this area on the vertebra, what kind of symptoms would you expect to see with that? That brings in understanding of the different plexi of which parts of the vertebrae or which parts of the spinal cord correlate with sensations from different parts of the body, et cetera, right? That would be a larger conceptual putting things together type of question. So keep that in mind, I guess. So understanding where these things cross kind of plays a big role in that. So a sensory nerve that is part of the spinothalamic pathway or one of the tracts of the spinothalamic pathway, right? Whatever portion of the spinal cord that it is coming from is going to relate to whatever part of the body it senses. And then if there is damage near that portion on the spinal cord, or let's say there's damage above it, so superior to where that information would be coming in on the same side, that would not affect your sensation. Right? So if this was from the lower thoracic portion of the spinal cord, and damage was anterior to it, so in the upper thoracic portion of your spinal cord on the same side, you wouldn't expect to have any issues with sensing information from that same side, right? Because it already decussates, it already transfers over immediately as it enters the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Are you guys following the idea I'm trying to say? And so if you were given, there is damage here, and then some options for what the result of that damage might be, what symptoms, your inability to sense or to respond or to give motor control of a certain area, should be able to put that together to answer that question. Like I said, there is at least one quiz question that shows you an example of that. Okay. So lastly, looking at our motor pathways, so our efferent division, again, E for the effect, the response to that affect, the cause, our efferent division, our motor pathways. So where we had mainly 3 neuron pathways for sensation, for our motor control, we're looking at a 2 neuron pathway. And these are just separated into upper and lower. So the first one is always going to be upper. These are all descending pathways, taking information down from the brain through the spinal cord to the muscle or gland when we talk about the visceral response that is going to be responding to it. So our upper motor neuron has a cell body within the CNS, whatever part of our central nervous system is processing it. And then the lower motor neuron is going to transmit or innervate that single motor unit, the muscle that is going to respond. It's going to have that response. These are descending pathways. Again, that information is going to leave through the dorsal or sorry, not the dorsal, the ventral or anterior horn in the root out to the body. It's going to be traveling down mainly through the anterior or ventral horns of the gray matter. And we again have three major pathways as part of our somatic motor control. We have our corticospinal, so starting in the cerebrum and traveling down the spine, and then medial and lateral pathways. The corticospinal tract is also often referred to as the pyramidal tract because of the pyramids of the medulla oblongata that play a role in this. But so those terms are synonymous. The corticospinal, pyramidal tract, they're referring to the same tract. And this is the only one that we're really focusing on as far as what you're asked about in the study guide. And so we can see another little example of how that works. So depending on which muscle, what part of the body this muscle is going, or yeah, where the muscle is, the location on the body that it is responding to, that information is going to synapse. Our first motor neuron, our upper motor neuron is going to synapse with the lower motor neuron at different places along the spinal cord and or brainstem here. So motor nuclei that are going to send out motor control through our cranial nerves can be found in either the midbrain here or the medulla oblongata. And so it is synapsing with the lower motor neuron in those portions of the brainstem and then leaving through the cranial nerve to whatever muscle of the face it is responding to. Most of the motor control that is going to the rest of our body is going to decussate in the medulla oblongata and then descend down the rest of the spinal cord and then leave, again, through that anterior horn, through the ventral root to whatever muscle it is innervating. We just have two neurons. The crossing over is either going to happen through the medulla oblongata if it's traveling to any of our spinal nerves, or the interneuron itself, the second, our lower motor neuron, is going to cross contralaterally to the opposite side. In the midbrain and in the medulla oblongata, if we're talking about cranial nerves, motor control of the face and skull and neck. And then again, you have that same reference slide with information about it. So on the study guide, I'm just asking about the corticospinal tract. It says to know details about the upper and lower neurons, their pathways and decussation, function, and type of motor info. So focusing a bit more on the different tracts and where they are decussating, where they are crossing. So that's kind of what we were just looking at here. We have some crossing in the midbrain as part of that corticobulbar tract. We have some crossing in the medulla oblongata as part of the lateral corticospinal tract. And then the primary or the upper motor neuron itself is going to decussate in the medulla oblongata and continue traveling down the spinal cord for that anterior corticospinal tract. Okay. So tried to keep this PowerPoint a bit short and sweet based on what I'd given you in the study guide. So yeah, is there anything from you reading the text that I could expand on or connect with what I've provided here? Is there any of this that didn't make sense as I was talking about it, or that you would like me to go back over a bit more slowly or more in depth? How are we feeling?
I like how you like synthesized the chapter into like a few of these slides. I think it's more helpful now that I'm seeing it in like small bits to process the whole chapter and like kind of pull everything else together because it seems like a lot
Yeah,
when you first read it and you're like, oh, like now I know all
good
these
job.
other little bits, more details about everything, but this kind of helps bring it to a big picture.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I did. I had to, for most of this last unit, I've been doing a lot of like building brand new PowerPoints rather than trying to edit old ones or ones that have been passed on to me. And so got to be a lot more focused on what I'm presenting. So thank you for that feedback. That's that. shows me that doing it this way is helpful in summarizing the major points, focusing on that conceptual stuff, which I tell you guys all the time is what I care about or like to teach about anyways. Okay. Um, should have spent more. I would like to give some practice, but I don't really have good questions laid out for this, besides the one that's on the quiz, for practice with that kind of cutting off. Maybe some in the textbook. Let me see if there's any straight up on the study guide that I could use. Okay, yeah, there's a couple questions on the study guide that we can kind of talk about and address together as a way of practicing that, combining all the information we've been discussing, like I said. So let me move this over. Let's start with question 15 here. So I can even put you guys in breakout rooms to kind of discuss this and where you're finding it. This may require pulling up either notes and or the PowerPoints from previous chapters, because it's going to require some combination of knowledge about the spinal nerves, with the pathways that we're talking about today. But I'm going to do it like this. Let's address these two questions. So I'm going to quickly throw you guys into some breakout rooms. I'll only do a few and make them like groups of 4 or so. And I want you guys to discuss how you would respond to a question like this. So 15 is saying damage to the posterior columns on the left side of the spinal cord at the L1 level would interfere with sensation and proprioception from which limb? And then 16, damage to the pyramidal pathway, which is that spinothalamic pathway, or no, the corticospinal pathway, the motor pathway, inferior to the medulla oblongata, but superior to C4, would cause a loss of motor function in which part of the body, which side. So I'm going to post these in the chat after I send you guys into breakout rooms. Just spend a few minutes finding the info from the PowerPoints and or your notes that you need, discuss your answers, and then we'll come back and see what you guys came up with. Like I said, I will send out the questions once you guys are in these rooms. You should have an invite now. Okay, we should have everyone back in here. So I want to just like quickly talk about what kinds of information you guys use, like your thought process going through answering these questions. I can share what my thought process was in answering them, and where I found the info that helps me get that answer. And so along with that, I guess I can give a lot of insight, or I can give more insight into what kind of response I would be looking for with a question like this. And I'm not even 100% sure if the response I have is a full response here. So we can learn a lot about this stuff together. Anyways, let's start with 15. So the scenario described is that there is damage to the posterior columns on the left side of the spinal cord at the L1 level. And it's asking, would this interfere with sensation and proprioception, or which limb would have interference with their sensation of proprioception and sensation? Gosh, the way I tried to rephrase that did not work. There's damage on the posterior columns, left side of the spinal cord at L1. This is going to interfere with sensation and proprioception from which limb? So, someone share how they went about addressing this question, or some insight into your thought process. I can share my thinking, I suppose. And then maybe you guys will be more incentivized to comment on it. So when getting a question like this, the way my brain works is I immediately want to identify the important parts of this sentence so I can cut out the noise. And so reading through this, I know we're talking about the posterior columns, so I immediately highlighted or bolded this. We know it's on the left side of our spinal cord. Can you stay down? And it's at the L1 level. And the question is asking for which limb would sensation be affected. So I know I need to look at our posterior columns and keep in mind that damage is at the L1 level. So I come over to my chapter 15 figure on our posterior column pathway. Looking at this, I can see that the information doesn't change side or decussate until the medulla oblongata. So information that was supposed to be coming from the same side of the body is going to be blocked off and thus isn't going to be received by that upper side. So let's pull this over. So since there is damage on the left side, that's only going to be affecting sensation from that left side of the body. Because there's no decussation, it does not cross over beforehand, or else that would be affecting the opposite side. L1 is part of the lumbar plexus, so this is only going to be affecting information from the lumbar plexus and below, which also includes the sacral plexus. And so we know we're just talking about the lower limbs. And since this was on the left side, we don't have decussation until the medulla oblongata. That means sensory information from that same side, the left side of the body, the left side, and so specifically our left leg, we are not going to be making, or is not going to get all the way to the brain. Okay. So since this isn't crossing over until the medulla oblongata, any info traveling up that left side of the body is going to be blocked off from anything below L1. I went over here to find where L1 sits in our plexi and get a generalization of what part of the body would be affected. And so saw these are mostly our lower limbs, the lower portion of the body. And so the left limb would be unable to transmit its feelings of sensation to the brain. Is that generally what you guys found? Was there different things that you considered in answering this that I didn't necessarily discuss? Is there anything you guys can?
I think our group thought it was the right leg because of the decussation at the medulla oblongata.
Okay,
This vision coming up from the right is going to cross
Mhm.
the posterior column. Yeah, and the posterior column on the left side will be receiving information from the right leg because of the decussation at the pyramids.
So the sensory information is traveling up the ipsilateral side until the medulla oblongata.
Yeah, and then
So
crosses to the contralateral side. So if the damage is to the dorsal column or at L1,
Mhm. So that damage is going to block information from the same side because it's below here. Right? If it decussated before that damage, then we would be blocking sensation from the opposite side.
yep,
But since it doesn't swap until here, it would be
okay.
blocking all, it would be stopping all of this. So the same side. We perceive it on the opposite hemisphere, or we should be perceiving it the opposite hemisphere because of the decussation here. But we're stopping that pathway really early on before it can cross. So the same side is being affected by that damage.
Okay.
Or that's the logic that I'm using for that. Like there's, if others want to jump in and add, right? I could be wrong, but I feel pretty confident in that. Oops. X or something. Block, that's fine. Right, we basically had damage down here. And so information from the same side is stopping at this point before it ever gets to cross. So same side is receiving that blockage compared to the side of the damage. It's the same side. Any other arguments or comments on that? So for question 16, was a lot less specific. We didn't get really a side, and it's happening much higher up in our spinal cord. And we're talking about a motor pathway, so it's going to be affecting a large portion of the body. Right? We're having damage really, really early on in that motor pathway. And so basically everything below it that is supposed to be able to transmit that signal out is going to be affected. So same kind of process of elimination or highlighting specific info. I highlighted pyramidal pathway. I know that it's below or inferior to our MO and superior to C4. So I came to chapter 15, pulled up our corticospinal pathway. Again, this is also called the pyramidal tract or pyramidal pathway. It's the same thing. And so I know it's below the medulla oblongata, and no matter which tract we're talking about here, decussation is going to happen above or in the medulla oblongata. And so whatever is going to be affected is going to be on the same side of that damage again, right? Because we have decussation happening outside of this, or I guess before. Trying to think of, I feel like I'm not explaining that great. But because this changing of what side is going to be controlled happens before our damage occurs, whatever side the damage is on, the parts of the body that are on that side are going to be affected. Right? So our same blockage is happening like here after it's already crossed. So whatever side the damage is on, it's going to be affecting that same side of the body, the muscles on that same side of the body. Okay. So it's below the medulla oblongata. So that led me to knowing it is the ipsilateral side. So whatever side this damage is on, the same side of the body is going to be affected because decussation happens before that. And so next, figuring out where it is, it's or superior to C4, but inferior to medulla oblongata. So going back to chapter 13, think about these. C4 is part of the cervical plexus. So these innervate the muscles of the neck and diaphragm. And so maybe some of these nerves are still intact. Again, it wasn't specific about exactly where this damage is. If it's at C4, then most of these nerves are still functioning. They're innervating the neck muscles that they're supposed to be functioning. But if it's super high up here, if it's like above C1 and just below the brainstem, then none of these muscles are going to be able to innervate, or none of these nerves are going to be able to innervate the muscles they're responsible for. And so responding to this should be or can be generalized rather than needing to get super specific. Constance made up or brought a good point about the phrenic nerve and its responsibility over the contractions of the diaphragm. And so breathing could be affected by this, right? Because that phrenic nerve is part of C3 through C5. So knowing that C4 is part of the cervical plexus and we could be talking about anywhere in there, my response was that loss of motor control to most of the ipsilateral side of the body below the neck, potentially including difficulty with breathing from the diaphragm, thanks to our discussion with Constance. And then a little extra of that some motor control of the neck may be intact depending on specifically where the damage occurs. Because again, if damage is low, if it's closer to C4, these nerves are still intact and unaffected. So whatever muscles they are innervating are going to be responding just fine. But anything below that damage is not going to be able to respond. And so if this question had been more specific, that this damage was on the left side, then most of the muscles of the left side of the body would be unresponsive. If that damage had been on the right side, then most of the muscles of the right side of the body would have been unresponsive. Unable to function.
Could you explain one more time why the damage would be ipsilateral?
Yeah. All right. So since the crossing, any kind of crossing that would happen in this pathway, we have information traveling down. So any of that info coming down here has already crossed to the side of the body that's going to innervate by the time we get to this region. And so we're looking at neurons and nerve fibers that are staying on this side all the way down and are also going to innervate the skeletal muscles on that same side. So if the blockage is at this region, right, there's no more crossing that's going to occur. And so there should be, oh, I guess we do have a little bit depending on the tract. Could be some damage, so that's complicating it. Our anterior corticospinal tract. So that makes our damage much larger. Sorry, that got me off track. So in general, since most of these nerve fibers have already decussated by the time we're reaching this damage, and those are supposed to be traveling down that same side of the body and innervating skeletal muscles on that same side of the body, then that tells me that this damage is going to affect that ipsilateral side.
Okay, because it's past the point of decussation where the damage is. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Right. So if the question had instead said this was happening above the medulla oblongata, right, and these fibers are supposed to switch or supposed to cross to innervate the skeletal muscles within the medulla oblongata, they're not going to reach that point of crossing. And so even though damage here is on the right side, the muscles affected are going to be on the left side because it hasn't crossed yet. But the damage happening here after crossing already occurred means that that damage is on the left side and the muscles that they innervate are also on the left side. So that stayed ipsilateral. So yeah, these are complex questions, lots of things to consider. So if I were to give a question like this on the exam, I would likely be quite specific, like it'd be more similar to question 15 rather than question 16. 16 was very general. I try to be as specific as possible. And I may even make it a multiple choice question instead of a short answer. If I do a multiple choice version, you'll probably see a couple of them, or maybe I'll do one multiple choice and one short answer. Get that, but I really like this type of question because of how much of the info you need to use to put that together. There's multiple concepts that play a role in it. Again, I know I need to be very careful and specific with how I phrase that question based on what you've been given on the study guide. So we'll see if that's even possible. So at the very least, there will at least be a multiple choice version of that question. Is there anything else about this I can discuss? Oh, it's 3:20. Yeah. So wrapping it up. If you have other questions about this or want to discuss this more, you're more than welcome to stay. For the brain case studies, like I mentioned at the beginning, the key is in the assignment now. So if you want to go see what the key is for this, what the famous patients and doctors were. This was the famous case study of HM. This is Phineas Gage. 3 and 4, we're talking about Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke. I don't expect you to know their first names unless you looked it up, but might have been able to tell that that was Broca and Wernicke. So check that out if you did it, even if you didn't do it. It's kind of cool to see those things. Those are some major cases that changed our understanding of how the brain works. And other than that, it is the end of class time, so you're free to go. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow.